I'm currently in the process of putting a new lift kit on my 3rd generation Tacoma. The front portion of the lift kit is complete, and in today's video, I'm gonna show you how to do the rear installation. Now, I do wanna point out that I am not a professional mechanic, so highly recommend that you watch my video and combine it with other videos that are out there, as well as instruction manuals to make sure that you're doing everything correctly. The lift kit that I'm gonna be installing on the vehicle is the Icon Stage 2 setup. It's a complete lift kit for front and rear. At the rear of the vehicle, we're gonna be putting on new shocks as well as an add-a-leaf. The kit costs about $2,050. I got it off of BillsteinLifts.com. If you haven't been on their website before, highly recommend that you go check it out. It is a great resource. This is my 3rd time using it, and it's an awesome website. You can put in your make, your model, and your generation of vehicle, and it will give you a full list of lift kits that are compatible with your vehicle. And if you go to their website and you buy an Icon setup and put in the coupon code MikeC1, you'll get 10% off your order. So a really great deal in that sense. Let me give you a quick look at the stock setup before we get going on the install. This is the TRD off-road model, so it's got the Bilstein shock, and then I do have a 1-inch Toy-Tech block in there currently. With the new add-a-leaf, I'm gonna be going up to 1.5 inches of lift in the rear, so a slight increase. And then I'm also considering getting a rooftop tent on the back at some point, and so I figured the add-a-leaf is gonna give me a little bit better weight capacity in the future. The advantage of the block is that it offers a slightly more factory-like ride. Now, if we jump around to the driver's side of the vehicle, I've already got the lift kit installed on this side, so I can give you a quick look at what that looks like. You'll see the new Icon shock, and then we've got our external reservoir over here on this side. Down below, we've got our add-a-leaf. So these bottom 3 pieces of the leaf spring, you can see are darker black. That's the new portion. One thing I will point out about this kit is that Icon markets it as a bolt-on solution, and while that's true at the front of the vehicle, not really all that true at the rear. I did have to cut the upper shock mount slightly here, and then I had to bolt through the frame, so I'm not crazy about that. If you go with the Icon Stage 1 setup, it's less expensive, doesn't have this external reservoir, and so there's no cutting or bolting required. I think I probably would have gone that route if I were to do it over again. It doesn't include the add-a-leaf, but you can buy that separately, or you can get an add-a-leaf from another company for slightly less. So again, I think I would go that route if I were gonna do it again. You'll see down here on the floor, we've got our stock overload spring, which I've removed, our stock shock, the 1-inch Toy-Tech block, which is definitely showing its age after a couple of years, the U-bolts that we removed, and then this little clip I didn't mention also had to be cut off the leaf springs here. So again, another piece that's got to be cut. So that's a look at the new kit. And then if we come over to this side again, give you a quick look at the tools we're going to need for the installation. You will need a drill and a 21/64 drill bit. Impact wrench isn't required, but it definitely helps make things a little bit easier. Safety glasses and gloves are a good idea, as well as ear protection. You're going to need something for cutting that upper shock mount, so a few options out there. And then U-joint press is going to be helpful. You can also do it if you've got some heavy-duty C-clamps. You'll see that mine's a little bit chintzy. So these in combination I feel pretty safe. That's for compressing the leaf springs. You're going to need measuring tape, socket set. Will be helpful to have a few deep sockets. So there are a few bolts that are a little bit hard to get off without that. Got this little drill bit for sanding once we make those cuts on the front or the upper shock mount. And then obviously a combination of socket wrenches. We've got our breaker bar, channel locks, and a hammer. So pretty basic tools for the install. Obviously floor jacks and jack stands are going to be critical as well. And because of the nature of this install, it's also really helpful if you've got 2 floor jacks, one to lift the vehicle and then another one for lifting the rear axle. So our first step is going to be to put the floor jack below the middle of this rear axle. That's to support the weight of the axle so that once we remove the shock, it doesn't drop down and hit the floor. So get that centered there in the middle. And then our first step is going to be to remove the 17mm bolt at the bottom here and then the 14mm bolt at the top. It's going to be helpful to have 2 wrenches for this so that we can keep it from spinning. And then we'll just loosen that guy up. Make sure that as you're removing all of these bolts and everything that you're putting them in a container so you don't lose anything. You'll see that we've got a nut and a washer that comes off with that bolt. Next up, we're removing the 14mm nut that's at the top of the shock. To do that, I've got channel locks and a 14mm wrench. That's so that I can grab onto the top and keep it from spinning as I twist the nut off with the wrench. Once we've got that nut off, pull off the washer, and then we're going to take the whole shock and just push down to compress it. Compress that and then move it out of the mount there, and then we'll pull out this bolt that's at the bottom, and our shock is free. All right, for the next step, we've got 4 22mm bolts that we need to remove on the bottom of these U-bolts. This is where the impact wrench is going to make the job a lot quicker, but again, it's not absolutely necessary, and you will probably need a deeper socket as the bolt may drop down further than your nut that you're removing. You may not be able to get it with a smaller one. All right, with that last nut removed, now we can pull this whole lower bracket off. I don't think the orientation really matters, but I'm going to keep it oriented the same way that it was on already when I reinstall it. So just make sure you keep track of that when you set this down. And then we'll remove these 2 U-bolts as well, and the bump stop. At this point, we're going to install our ball joint press here. Get it nice and close to the axle, hand tight, and then we will tighten it the rest of the way with the wrench. And then we've got our C-clamps on the inside as well. We're just going to get it nice and tight so that there's no gap between these leaf springs where it's connected there. And then once we've got this compressed, we've got a bolt on the top here that we're going to remove. We also want to make sure to remove this 12mm bolt right here. This little bracket is connected to our brake line, and when the axle drops down, if this is connected, it could break that line. So we want to make sure to get that removed. This should have been probably an earlier step in the process, and I just remembered, thankfully. Get that off, and then now that brake line is free from that little bracket. Now that the springs are compressed with the ball joint press and our C-clamp, now we're ready for a 14mm nut up here. We're gonna loosen this guy. Once we've got that loose, we can do it by hand. And once we have this nut off, now we can very carefully release the pressure on our C-clamp and our ball joint press. All right, and there we go, we're released, and now you can see that we've got some space between these leaf springs there, nice and loose. So now that we've done that, next step, we're gonna drop the rear axle down slightly so we can get this block out, as well as the overload springs. Now you see this brake line's a little bit tight. It does have some flexibility, but just to be on the safe side, I'm gonna go ahead and remove this 12mm bolt as well, just so that we don't create any issues with that brake line. And we may need to drop the rear axle down a little further too. So again, having that flexibility will be helpful if it comes to that. So this is the new add leaf that we're going to be putting on the truck. You'll see that from this center bolt, it's shorter on this direction than it is on this side. The longer portion is going to go to the back of the vehicle. And seeing as it's centered right here, you'll notice that this back end right here conflicts with this little clip. So we're going to have to remove this clip from the leaf springs. And then on the bottom, there's a rivet. We've got to sand that down so we've got a nice smooth surface. And then this will be able to fit nicely. All right, with this clip off, we did put a little paint on the bottom here just to protect that from corrosion. And now that we've got that clip off, we're ready to install the add-a-leaf. Now before we install the new add-a-leaf, we will need to remove this bolt, nut, and this center washer. You can do it with a 17mm wrench and socket on both this side and that side. And then right here in the middle, we also need to remove this 14mm nut. Now once we get this 14mm nut off, we've got this bolt going through the middle, and then this little piece here, we're going to discard this, and then we're ready to install it. Now when I installed this on the driver's side, I did find this to be the trickiest step. The reason for that is we've got to get this bolt centered through all of these leaves as well as these ones, these little plates that are still in there, and we've got to get it centered with this hole on the bottom. And it's a little tricky to get it all in there and get those all to line up perfectly. Hopefully we'll have a little better luck on this side than we did on the driver's side. We'll line that up there. And then we may need to kind of shift the axle back and forth a little bit to just kind of get things lined up. Likewise, we can shift the leaves themselves slightly to get them lined up with those holes. Now, as we get the bolt lined up with these holes, we will lift the axle with our floor jack to kind of push things into position. Oh yeah, that feels good. That's a little bit of a game to get those to all to line up as they should. All right, so we're gonna go ahead and put that C-clamp back on and the ball joint press. And we're gonna go ahead and compress down these leaf springs, and then we'll install this 14mm nut in that center bolt. So we'll go ahead and get them hand tight, and then we'll use the wrench to get that ball joint press nice and tight. So now that we've got this bolt tightened, unfortunately this little bolt on the bottom doesn't line up with the hole that we've got down below. Originally I had the whole axle lined up with it, but the bolt was crooked, so I lifted it back up to make sure I've got it nice and straight, and now we've got to get that hole to line up with that bolt head before we drop this back down. We can go ahead and remove our C-clamp and ball joint press now that we've got that bolt on there. Just be a trick to try to figure out how we can get that hole lined up as it should be. So by lifting up the other side of the vehicle and kind of shuffling things around, I was able to get this lined up nice and flush. So we'll raise that up just enough that we've got a zero gap in between the leaf springs and the axle. And now we're ready to put our U-bolts back on. Next step is we want to leave about a 1/2 inch of threads above this nut, so we're going to cut off from about here up, and that is so that our bump stop will fit on top. You can see if we put it on there right now, it doesn't fit. By cutting off the rest of that, this will sit flush on the top of those leaf springs. So with that cut off, the bump stop now sits nice and flush. Next step at this point is we're going to grab this little bracket that goes on the bottom, as well as our new U-bolts. I'm gonna just set this on here, and then to get this to go through those holes on the bottom, you may need to squeeze it together slightly. And then we've got the one that goes on the back. Likewise, you'll need to squeeze that to get it to fit through as well. All right, so with that bracket and U-bolts on, we've got 4 new washers and bolts that we're gonna go ahead and get on here hand tight. Get them started. Once we get the 4th one on, then again using our impact wrench and a 22mm socket, we're going to get these tight. And we want to make sure to go in a crisscross pattern, kind of back and forth between the 4 corners. And we want to get these threads nice and even at the top so that none of the 4 bolts are tighter than the other 3. With that, the add leaf is complete and we've got everything put back together here. The next step is to trim this upper shock mount so that we can install the shock. First step for that is that we need to get the shock in position so we can figure out what kind of trimming is necessary. So we'll go ahead and line up the lower portion of the shock with the lower shock mount. And then with our lift kit, you're going to get 2 rubber bushings, 2 metal washers, and you'll see that one of them's got a slightly larger diameter in the middle. That one is going to go on the top of the shock here below the mount, and then we'll put one of the rubber bushings on the bottom, and then likewise we'll put one of those rubber bushings on top and another washer on top of that, and then of course a bolt. So we'll go ahead and get this lined up appropriately. You want to have the Icon logo facing out here, and then our external reservoir is going to mount over on this side, so you want this hose kind of right over at that connection. Now I'm not going to get everything quite into position, but we're going to grab a marker, and you'll see that although we're in pretty good shape right now, once we put that bushing on top and another metal washer and that bolt, and we start to compress things, this right here is going to get very close to that upper mount. So that's where we're going to run into a clearance issue. And so we're going to mark out a cut line to trim along that upper mount, and then we'll remove the shock and make those cuts. So basically we're going to just kind of... So with that, I'm now going to remove this shock and we'll trim out this piece of metal. So you can see now that our cut is complete, and then I've also sprayed it with some primer just to help with resistance to future corrosion. When I have a chance, I'm gonna go grab some black paint to go with that. And now we're ready for the fun part. We're gonna put our rear shock in place. We'll start by getting this lower portion of the shock lined up with that lower mount. Line up with that hole, and then we're gonna be using the 17mm bolt that we took out earlier. So this is not a new part, we're reusing the old bolt. And then likewise, we've got a nut and a washer that are gonna go on the inside. So we're just gonna get that hand tight for now until we get the upper part in position, and then we'll tighten it up. Again, on the top of the shock here, we've got that metal washer. It's got the larger center hole, and then one of our rubber bushings. And we're just going to compress the shock down, line it up with the hole, and then once that's in position, we've got another rubber bushing that's going to go on top. And with this, you want to face down on the top, and then on the bottom it's facing like this, going up. So we're going to pop that on, and then likewise on the bottom, washers like this. On the top, we're going to be facing it this direction. And then we've got this nut that came with the Icon lift that's going to go on top. Once this is hand tight, we're going to use a 19mm wrench to tighten it up. Unfortunately, we don't have the clearance for that socket wrench up top. Now before we get that too tight, I also want to tighten up that nut down at the bottom. Again, that's a 17mm. And then we'll go ahead and continue to tighten this nut at the top. Next up, we've got to position this external reservoir and install the bracket that's going to hold it. It's going to go right up here on the frame, and you want to make sure that you leave enough flexibility in this hose for the shock to cycle. So we're going to position it with just a little bit of slack in there so that it's not too tight. And then we got this little bracket that comes with this reservoir. It's basically going to mount directly behind the reservoir. And then we've got these to position on either side of that and hold it into place. So we're just gonna get this lined up in the position that we want it, put this behind, and then we're gonna mark this center hole, and then we're gonna drill through there with a 21/64 bit. Now that we've got that hole in place, we're ready to install the bracket. We've got this bolt and washer that just go through there, and then this will screw right into the frame. We're going to get it partway tight before we put on those clamps. They will need to fit between this bracket and the frame. Now before this is all the way tight, we are going to take these two little brackets and we're going to slide them on here and then line them up with this bracket. These fit between the frame and the bracket. Tighten those guys up with a flathead screwdriver. So with this external reservoir in place, we're going to go ahead and finish tightening this 14mm bolt before we tighten these clamps all the way. And with that all the way tight, now we're just going to go ahead and tighten these clamps down the rest of the way, and we are good to go. And then before we're finished, we do need to put this little attachment back on using the bolt that we removed originally. All right, so we got that one tight. Unfortunately, this one right here, we're not gonna be able to reattach. If we did, and you were to extend your travel all the way, put too much pressure on here. So we've got to leave this loose so it's got that flexibility to move up and down with the suspension. So we're going to cut this piece off, and then the installation is complete. So that is the rear add-a-leaf and shock replacement for the 3rd generation Tacoma. If you do have any comments or questions on this install, leave them in the section below. For more videos of the 3rd gen Tacoma, be sure to subscribe. In the meantime, thanks for watching.